who were of Salanter's main disciples? How did they carry on Mussar movement?
Yeah, so Rabbi Yisrael actually, of course, he never had a yeshiva. I mean, for a short time in his life, he actually was a Rosh Yeshiva, but he left that position. And again, legend has it, and it might be true, that because there was a person that he was replacing, when he discovered he was replacing somebody, he left the job because he didn't want to be responsible for someone losing their parnasa. That would be a typical Rabbi Yisrael response. But after that, he never really had a yeshiva. He taught Talmidim privately, small groups, but he did have many, many Talmidim, and his Talmidim fall into different groups. He had Talmidim who became Gedolim, Balei Mussar. He had Talmidim who became businessmen and Balabatim, etc. But among his Talmidim, there are quite a few, but I'll mention maybe 3 of them. And that is the probably the one who was closest to him was of Simcha Zissel Brady, who is, or sometimes of Simcha Zissel Ziv, the last names are always not clear, and he was known as the Alter, the old man of Kelm. Kelm was a city on the German-Lithuanian border, and that's where he started a yeshiva based on the teachings of Rabbi Salanter. So that's the Alter of Kelm. Kelm tended to be the breeding ground for virtually all of the later Balei Mussar, Rav Dessler and the like, Rav Elia Lapian, etc. Then we had Rav Yitzhak Blazer, who at one point in his life was the Rav in St. Petersburg, Russia, so he's known in Yiddish as Rav Itzela Petterberger. And B'Seif Yamav, he came to Eretz Yisrael, and he died in Eretz Yisrael in the beginning of the 20th century. And the third is also an altar. So we have the altar of Kelm, and we have Rav Itzela Petterberger, who's not called altar. And then we have the altar of Navardik, Rav Yosef Yezel Horowitz. And then we might have a third altar, Rav Nassim Tzvi Finkel, the altar of Slobodka. Now, the altar of Slobodka, not so clear you could really classify him as a Talmud of Rabbi Yisrael Salanter. He did know Rabbi Yisrael, and he learned from Rabbi Yisrael, B'Seif Yamav of Rabbi Yisrael, but essentially the altar of Slobodka was really a Talmud of Rav Simcha Zissel of Kelm, although he developed a different shita. And I should add also Rav Naftali Amsterdam. So I think I mentioned 5 Talmidim. So we have the altar of Kelm, Rav Naftali Amsterdam, Rav Itzela Petterberger, the altar of Navardik, and the altar of Slobodka. Although I say altar of Slobodka is more properly a Talmud of Rav Simcha Zissel. And all of these personalities became very, very great and very well known in the Torah world. The altar of Slobodka and Rav Itzela Petterberger were in Slobodka, as Rav Naftali Amsterdam was in Slobodka. Slobodka became a big place of growth. Rav Simcha Zissel had his own Mossad in Kelm. But what's interesting is, there's a children's story of, they call it 7 blind men and an elephant, meaning 7 blind people feel an elephant, and they're asked to describe what it feels like. So the person who felt the ears said, an elephant is a gigantic butterfly. The person who felt the trunk said the elephant is a big eel. And the person who felt the leg says, the elephant is like a tree. Now, the upshot is each description is correct, but each is only a partial description of a whole. Rabbi Yisrael Salanter was so multifaceted, so to speak, that different Talmidim pulled out different drachim, and therefore the Kelm Shita of Mussar was different than the Slobodka Shita of Mussar, and the Slobodka Shita of Mussar was different than the Navardik Shita of Mussar, and each one emphasized different aspects of Rabbi Yisrael's teachings. The altar of Kelm, who probably was the closest to Rabbi Yisrael Salanter, he had spent the greatest number of years. So Kelm was all about inner discipline, self-mastery, and fostering calmness rather than agitation. Because there is this concept that when you're nervous, when you're agitated, you're not thinking straightly. Now, I think even in military surgeons, combat surgeons, who have to do things very, very quickly, I think there's a saying, if somebody has a torn artery, he says, you can fix it in 2 minutes if you don't rush. If you rush, you're going to mess up. So Kelm was all about developing a certain inner calmness along with discipline. So you never got flustered. You never got excited. And because of this, in Kelm, there were all sorts of, we might even call them crazy, character building exercises. So for example, after a tinus, when a person is very hungry and they tend to eat quickly. So in Kelm, they would serve fish with a lot of bones, which forces you to take a little bit at a time. Or if you got a letter or a food package from home, you had to wait 24 hours before opening it. It shouldn't just be, I rushed to do it. Or you had to get up in the middle of the night for a 5-minute learning session, no more and no less. What's the purpose of a 5-minute learning session in the middle of the night? Because, they wake you up 10 minutes. You got to get dressed in 5 minutes, meaning you can't afford to be 1 or 2 minutes late. And that teaches you the discipline of time. Rav Yaakov Kamenetsky told the story. Of course, he was in Kelm after the Alter of Kelm died. That when he was 16 years old, he came to Kelm and, to absorb the Mussar of Kelm. And at one point, it was a day of Kriyas Torah, and the Gabbai thought there was no Kohen and was about to call up a Yisrael. And Yaakov noticed a Kohen had walked in. So he went over to the Gabbai and said, "Oh, there's a Kohen here." So after davening, the Gabbai went over to him and said, "I want to thank you for pointing out that there's a Kohen, but you have a knas of 1 ruble," or something like that. He says, "Why?" He says, "Because in Kelm, we don't look around who comes in and who comes out. We focus on what we're doing, etc." So Kelm was always about the notion of discipline, but it was not, but again, it's interesting, self-discipline, but not in a context of anxiety, but in a sense of calmness, deliberation, thinking before you acted. Right? That was kind of what the mark of Kelm. The Alter of Slobodka, who of course was a Talmud of the Alter of Kelm, had a bit of a different emphasis, again, not contradicting necessarily, in which he emphasized godless thought. That instead of focusing on all of my faults, I should recognize the greatness of man, their creativity, their potential. And through that godless Adam, I will become a greater person because I want to grow. I want to become the person I'm able to become. That's why in Slobodka, there was such an emphasis on individuality. Slobodka had Gedolim, Rav Hutner, and Rav Aaron Cutler, and Rav Yaakov Kamenetsky, and my own Rosh Hashiva, Rav Yaakov Ruderman, Rav Yechiel Yaakov Weinberg, the Sridei Eish, and actually many, 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 many more. And the hallmark is that everybody was unique. Everybody was different. Everybody, and in fact, the downside is Slobodka had its share of creative apikorsim. This is always the risk of creating a Mossad based on individuality. Because when you're not trying to produce cookie cutter imitations, then everybody's going to gravitate to their particular niche. So on one hand, I think it's fair to say, some would disagree maybe, that Slobodka produced the greatest number of Gedolim and perhaps the greatest number of apikorsim, because that's what individuality does. That's why even today, when a person starts a yeshiva, a person has to think, how much leeway do I want to give people to grow in their own particular ways and the like. So if Kelm emphasized self-mastery, discipline, and inner calm, Slobodka emphasized greatness, individuality, creativity, and the like. Navardik, in many ways, was the most eccentric of the schools, maybe the most extreme of the schools. The Alter of Navardik himself spent almost 2 years locked up in a house like a hermit, in which people had to feed him food through holes in the wall. In fact, the Aruch HaShulchan was the Rebbe of Navardik, and people went to the Aruch HaShulchan and said, "This guy is crazy. Let's tear down the house." And the Aruch HaShulchan said, "I don't understand Rav Yezel Horowitz. I don't understand Rav Yezel's derech, but he's an ish kadosh. Let's leave him alone." But after those 2 years, he established 100 yeshivas in the middle of Russia, which endured in the darkest moments of Stalin. It was Novardok and Chabad that kept Torah alive in the Soviet Union during the Stalinist era, no matter what. So the semel of Novardok is unconditional emuna and bitachon in Hashem. That you never ask the question, can I do this? You simply ask the question, is this something that is worthwhile to do? If it is, then you start doing it with the certainty that somehow Hashem is going to come through. Now, this was actually an issue in which the Chazon Ish had, part of the Chazon Ish's issue with Mussar was actually a particular issue with Novardok, because the Chazon Ish maintained that the notion of Gamzu L'Tova and Kalma de Avad Rachmana L'Tav doesn't mean you'll always get, what it is that you want. Rather, even when there are defeats and failures, that's also Hashem's ultimate blessing. Novardok seemed to have a different view of Emunah, that if you have Emunah, it's gonna come, and the like. In fact, they tell the story about one of the later Rosh Yeshivas of the Novardok Yeshiva in France, Rav Gershon Liebman, that he once came to America for fundraising, and a certain Talmud saw him in the airport and said, "Oh, Rabbi, can I give you a ride?" And the Rosh Yeshiva said, "Yes, I thank you very much." And as they're driving, the Talmud has a certain question he wants to ask his Rebbe. He's not sure if he could ask his Rebbe the question. He said, Rebbe, I know that you didn't know I was going to be at the airport, and I know you don't carry money on you, which you didn't. So I'm just wondering exactly, if I wouldn't have been here, how would you have gotten to the place you needed to go? So Rav Gershon Liebman said, you were there, weren't you? What's the problem? I knew somebody would be there. I didn't know who. That's the unconditional emunah. So in a sense, we have these three different strands. We have the inner calm of self-discipline. We have the godless adam of creativity. And we have the radical, unconditional emunah and bitachon, that Hashem will always give you the tools that you need to carry out your job. And each of them emphasize these different things. And these are all pieces that they pulled off the great tree that Rabbi Yisrael Salanter was.